In the heart of Mineral Wells, Texas, a 14-story giant stands silent against the sky. The Baker Hotel rises above the modest downtown like a monument from another age. Its Spanish colonial towers visible for miles, its hundreds of windows dark and empty. For decades, this massive structure has loomed over the town, neither alive nor truly dead. A palace frozen between glory and ruin. But this is not a story of murder. There are no hidden bodies, no bloody scandals sealed behind its walls. The darkness that haunts the Baker Hotel is quieter, more unsettling. It is the darkness of misplaced faith. Thousands once traveled to this grand hotel believing they would be healed. They came seeking cures for ailments that troubled their bodies and minds, trusting in the mineral waters that flowed beneath the building. They paid for treatments, soaked in therapeutic baths, and drank from springs that promised miracles. The hotel sold them hope wrapped in luxury, and for a brief, shining moment, people believed. But the cures were illusions. When medical science finally caught up, when penicillin replaced pseudoscience, the faith that built this palace collapsed overnight. The guests stopped coming, the town's economy crumbled, and the Baker Hotel, once the crown jewel of Texas, became a monument to the danger of believing too deeply in promises that were never true. How does something this grand fall so completely? The answer begins in an era when America was desperate to believe in miracles. Chapter 1. The Era of Miracle Water. The 1920s marked the final, glittering years of America's Gilded Age optimism. The nation had survived a world war and was racing headlong into an era of prosperity, innovation, and spectacle. Jazz filled the air. Automobiles crowded the streets. Electricity lit up cities that had been dark for centuries. In this atmosphere of progress and possibility, Americans believed that science could solve anything, even if what they called science was nothing more than wishful thinking dressed in medical terminology. Across the country, a peculiar obsession gripped the public imagination: mineral springs. From the grand resorts of Hot Springs, Arkansas, to the elegant spas of Saratoga Springs, New York, Americans flocked to natural springs, believing the waters held miraculous healing properties. It wasn't just a trend, it was an industry. Hotels, bathhouses, and entire towns built their economies on the promise that soaking in mineral-rich water could cure ailments that doctors couldn't touch. In Texas, a small town named Mineral Wells stumbled into this national craze almost by accident. In the 1880s, a local family drilling for drinking water struck something unexpected: water so heavily saturated with minerals that it left a thick, chalky residue. The water tasted sharp and metallic, nothing like the clean well water they had hoped for. But someone decided to drink it anyway, and soon after, wild claims began to spread. People said the water cured arthritis. Others swore it healed stomach troubles, skin diseases, even infertility. The most extraordinary claim gave the water its famous name: crazy water. According to local legend, a woman suffering from severe mental illness drank from the well and was miraculously restored to sanity. Whether the story was true hardly mattered. Once the tale spread, people began arriving from across Texas and beyond, desperate to drink from the same source. By the 1890s, Mineral Wells transformed from an unremarkable frontier settlement into a booming health resort town. Wells were drilled throughout the area, each one tested and marketed based on its mineral content. Water was bottled and shipped nationwide. Bathhouses opened along the main streets. Doctors, legitimate physicians with medical degrees, began prescribing trips to Mineral Wells the way modern doctors prescribe physical therapy. But there was a problem, though few people acknowledged it at the time. There was almost no scientific evidence that mineral baths cured anything. The treatments were built on testimonials, anecdotes, and the powerful placebo effect of belief itself. Patients arrived sick, soaked in warm mineral water, rested in comfortable hotels, ate regular meals, and often felt better. They credited the water, not the rest or the change of environment. Medical journals of the era published glowing reports about mineral spring therapy. But these studies lacked control groups, peer review, or any rigorous methodology. The gap between hope and evidence was enormous, but in an age before antibiotics, before modern surgery, before reliable treatments for most diseases, people had little choice but to hope. And hope, when wrapped in luxury and sold with confidence, was enough to build empires. Mineral Wells was ready for its palace. All it needed was a dreamer bold enough to build it. Chapter 2. T.B. Baker, the Hotel Magnate's Vision. Theodore Brasher Baker was not a man who thought small. By the early 1920s, he had already established himself as one of Texas's most successful hotel developers, a figure whose name was synonymous with grand architecture and urban ambition. The Baker Hotel in Dallas stood as a landmark of sophistication in the state's largest city. The Hotel Texas in Fort Worth became the social center of the cattle capital. Even beyond Texas, Baker's influence reached into Missouri, where he managed the Connor Hotel in Joplin. His hotels weren't just places to sleep, they were destinations, symbols of a city's arrival into modernity and prosperity. Baker understood something fundamental about the hotel business. People didn't just pay for rooms and meals. They paid for experience, for prestige, for the feeling that they were a part of something larger than themselves. His hotels featured the finest furnishings, the most advanced conveniences, and the kind of elegant design that made guests feel they had stepped into a different world. When T.B. Baker built a hotel, the city itself changed around it. In 1922, the citizens of Mineral Wells came to Baker with a proposal and a problem. Their town had grown wealthy on mineral water, but they lacked a hotel worthy of the town's national reputation. Worse, most of the profits from visiting tourists were flowing into the pockets of outsiders who owned the existing hotels and bathhouses. The town's leading citizens had raised $150,000, a substantial sum, and they wanted to build a hotel owned by local shareholders, a hotel that would keep Mineral Wells' prosperity in Mineral Wells. But they needed more than money. They needed vision, expertise, and a name that would attract investors and guests. They needed T.B. Baker. Baker saw the opportunity immediately. Mineral Wells wasn't just another small Texas town. It was a health resort with a growing national reputation, drawing visitors from across the country. The market was there, untapped and waiting. More importantly, Baker recognized that this wasn't just a business opportunity. This was a chance to build something unprecedented, not merely a luxury hotel, but a healing palace, a grand resort that would combine the elegance of his urban hotels with the therapeutic promise of the mineral springs. He envisioned a destination so magnificent that it would put Mineral Wells on the map alongside Hot Springs and Saratoga Springs. Baker hired Wyatt C. Hedrick, a respected architect known for his ability to blend beauty with functionality. Hedrick's design drew inspiration from the Arlington Hotel in Hot Springs, Arkansas, already famous for its integration of mineral water therapy and luxury accommodations. But Baker wanted something grander, something that would dominate the landscape and announce its importance from miles away. Construction began in 1926 with tremendous fanfare. The foundation was laid, the basement completed, and workers began raising the steel frame that would support 14 stories of Spanish colonial revival architecture. The building would house 450 guest rooms, 2 elegant ballrooms, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, and an in-house beauty shop. Every modern convenience would be included. This would be a hotel worthy of the new American century. And then abruptly, construction stopped. Baker had traveled to California on business, and while there, he visited a hotel with an unusual feature, a swimming pool. It was a novelty at the time, something most hotels didn't have. But Baker saw more than a novel. He saw the perfect centerpiece for his healing palace, an Olympic-sized swimming pool filled with the very mineral water that had made Mineral Wells famous. Guests could swim in the therapeutic waters, combining recreation with the promise of healing. There was just one problem. The basement had already been completed, the foundation, and lower structure were finished. Building a massive swimming pool now would require placing it on top of the existing basement, a challenging and expensive engineering feat. The basement would have to be repurposed as a work area for hotel staff and a changing area for guests. Baker didn't hesitate. He ordered the redesign. When the Baker Hotel opened, it would feature Texas's first hotel swimming pool, Olympic-sized, filled with mineral water, and unlike anything else in the state. Construction resumed, but the addition of the pool extended the timeline and increased costs. Workers labored for 3 years, raising the massive structure, stone by stone, floor by floor. The tower grew until it dominated the Mineral Wells skyline, visible from every corner of town and from the highways leading in. Inside, craftsmen installed elaborate tile work, carved woodwork, and the mechanical systems that would make the hotel a marvel of modern engineering. The final cost reached $1.2 million, the equivalent of roughly $22 million today. It was an enormous investment, a gamble that the combination of luxury and healing would draw enough guests to justify the expense. But T.B. Baker believed in the promise he was selling. Luxury plus healing equals transformation. Come to the Baker Hotel, soak in the mineral waters, sleep in elegant rooms, and leave a different person than you arrived. It was a powerful promise, one that would draw thousands through the hotel's doors. The question that no one asked in 1929 was simple but crucial. What happens when people stop believing in the promise? Chapter 3. The Grand Opening, November 1929. The Baker Hotel opened its doors to the public on November 9th, 1929. The timing could not have been more darkly ironic. Just days earlier, on October 24th, the stock market had begun its catastrophic collapse, an event that would come to be known as Black Thursday. Within weeks, billions of dollars in wealth would evaporate, banks would fail, businesses would shutter, millions of Americans would lose their jobs, their savings, their homes. The Great Depression was beginning, and it would define the next decade of American life. Yet, on November 22, 1929, the Baker Hotel celebrated its grand opening with a gala that embodied everything the coming years would deny most Americans: excess, optimism, and unshakable confidence in the future. Guests arrived in their finest evening wear. Music filled the ballrooms. Champagne flowed despite prohibition. The celebration announced to Texas and the nation that mineral wells had arrived, that this small town now possessed one of the grandest hotels in the entire South. The building itself was breathtaking. 14 stories of Spanish colonial revival architecture rose above the modest downtown, its towers and arches visible for miles across the rolling Texas landscape. The cream-colored exterior gleamed in the sunlight. At night, lights blazed from hundreds of windows, turning the structure into a beacon that could be seen from distant highways. For the 6,000 residents of Mineral Wells, the hotel was a source of enormous pride, proof that their town mattered, that it could compete with cities 10 times its size. But the true marvel was what waited inside. From the moment guests stepped through the entrance, they encountered innovations that seemed almost magical for 1929. Every one of the 450 guest rooms was connected to an advanced hydraulic system that circulated ice water throughout the building. Guests could turn a tap and pour themselves a glass of cold water without ever leaving their rooms, a luxury that most Americans, even wealthy ones, couldn't enjoy in their own homes. The lighting and ventilation systems operated with an intelligence that amazed visitors. When a guest inserted their key into the door lock and entered their room, the lights and ceiling fan activated automatically. When they left and locked the door behind them, the systems shut off. The hotel anticipated the guests' needs before they even had to think about them. Perhaps most ingenious was the valet compartment built into each room. A small door allowed guests to place their soiled laundry in a compartment accessible from the hallway. Hotel staff could collect the clothing and return it cleaned and pressed without ever entering the guest's private space. It was a level of service and discretion that spoke to the Bakers' ambition to cater not just to the comfortable middle class, but to the truly wealthy. In the coming years, the hotel would add even more modern conveniences, including full air conditioning by the 1940s, making it one of the few fully climate-controlled buildings in Texas, a tremendous advantage in the brutal summer heat. But the heart of the Baker Hotel was always the healing center. The second floor housed an elaborate spa facility with treatment rooms, massage tables, and rows of private mineral baths. Guests could choose hot baths that opened their pores and made them sweat, or cooler baths that refreshed and invigorated. Attendants in crisp white uniforms guided visitors through their treatments, explaining the therapeutic benefits of each procedure with the confidence of medical professionals. The crown jewel, of course, was the swimming pool. It represented everything T.B. Baker had envisioned: grandeur, novelty, and healing combined in one spectacular feature. It was the first hotel pool in Texas, and guests could swim in the same waters that had drawn thousands to Mineral Wells for decades. The pool area echoed with laughter and splashing, surrounded by columns and archways that gave it the feeling of an ancient Roman bath transported to the Texas frontier. High above, on the 14th floor, the Cloud Room Ballroom offered views that took guests' breath away. Standing at those windows, visitors could see across the entirety of Palo Pinto County, the landscape rolling away in every direction. The room could accommodate hundreds for dances, conventions, and celebrations. When the big band music played and couples swept across the polished floor, it felt like the top of the world. The hotel's meeting capacity was staggering for a town the size of Mineral Wells. The ballrooms and convention spaces could host 2,500 attendees, nearly half the town's entire population. This wasn't an accident. T.B. Baker had built the hotel to serve not just overnight guests, but to function as a regional convention center, drawing organizations from across Texas and beyond. For an ordinary person walking through those doors for the first time, the experience must have felt transformative. Most Americans in 1929 had never stayed in a hotel this grand. Chapter 4. The Golden Age. Throughout the 1930s, as breadlines stretched around city blocks and dust storms turned fertile farmland into wasteland, the Baker Hotel thrived. It was a paradox that seemed to defy economic gravity. While banks failed across America and unemployment reached 25%, guests continued streaming into Mineral Wells, filling the Baker's 450 rooms, packing its restaurants, and booking treatments at the spa. The hotel became a strange oasis of prosperity in a nation drowning in hardship. The reason for this success was both simple and profound. People were desperate for hope, desperate for healing, desperate for any escape from the grinding misery of the Depression. If conventional medicine couldn't cure their ailments, and in the 1930s, it often couldn't, then perhaps the mineral waters of Texas could. If their lives felt hopeless, perhaps a few days of luxury at the Baker could restore their spirits. The hotel offered something more valuable than mere accommodation, and for a remarkable period, the guests who walked through those doors included some of the most famous names in America. Clark Gable, Hollywood's leading man, stayed at the Baker during his rise to stardom. Judy Garland, whose voice would soon captivate the world in The Wizard of Oz, sought respite in the mineral baths. Glenn Miller and Lawrence Welk, titans of the big band era, brought their music and their ailments to Mineral Wells. A young politician named Lyndon B. Johnson, decades before he would become president, visited the hotel on state business. Even the Three Stooges, comedy legends in their own right, spent time at the Baker between performances. Local legend whispers of even more notorious guests. Old-timers in Mineral Wells still insist that Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, the infamous outlaws who terrorized the Southwest, hid at the Baker between robberies. Whether true or embellished over decades of retelling, the story captured something essential about the hotel. It was a place where people could disappear into luxury and anonymity, where even criminals might find temporary refuge. What drew these celebrities and politicians wasn't just the opulence, though. That certainly helped. The Baker offered something rare and precious. Famous guests could escape the scrutiny of big city life while still enjoying world-class accommodations. But more than that, they came for the same reason everyone else came. They believed in the healing power of the mineral waters. Guests didn't simply take baths. They underwent prescribed therapeutic regimens designed to address their particular ailments. A person suffering from arthritis might be directed to a series of hot mineral baths, the water heated to specific temperatures believed to ease joint pain. Someone with skin conditions would soak in cooler baths rich in sulfur and other minerals. Digestive troubles called for drinking prescribed amounts of the mineral water throughout the day. The sharp metallic taste, a small price to pay for promised relief. The treatment rooms bustled with activity. Attendants wrapped guests in hot towels soaked in mineral water, the fabric pressed against sore muscles and aching backs. Massage therapists worked therapeutic oils into skin, combining traditional techniques with the supposed benefits of mineral absorption. Some guests underwent elaborate procedures involving steam cabinets, where only their heads protruded, while their bodies absorbed mineral-saturated vapor. The belief system was specific and absolute. Different springs around mineral wells were said to cure different ailments. The hotel's promotional materials featured testimonials from satisfied guests who swore they had arrived sick and departed healed. These weren't vague claims. People described specific improvements, detailed their symptoms before and after, and attributed their recoveries entirely to the mineral water. And the guests genuinely believed. This wasn't cynicism or desperation alone. People arrived skeptical and left as converts. They felt better after their stays, whether from the rest, the change of environment, the placebo effect of belief itself, or some genuine if minor benefit from the minerals. What mattered was the conviction that the water worked. The marketing reinforced this belief at every turn. Hotel brochures read like medical pamphlets, listing ailments and recommended treatments. Local doctors, legitimate physicians with medical degrees, referred patients to the mineral baths as confidently as they prescribed any other therapy. In an era before antibiotics, before most effective medications, mineral water therapy occupied a gray zone between folk remedy and accepted medical practice. But the entire economy of mineral wells had become completely dependent on the hotel and the mineral water industry it represented. Smaller hotels and boarding houses filled with overflow guests. Bathhouses lined the streets, each claiming superior mineral content in their waters. Restaurants, shops, taxi services, bottling operations, all of these businesses existed because people believed in the healing power of the springs. The culture surrounding the mineral waters was total and consuming. Families saved for months to afford a week at mineral wells. People traveled hundreds of miles, crossing multiple states, specifically to drink and bathe in water that tasted terrible but promised miracles. By the late 1930s, penicillin was being refined for widespread clinical use. The medical establishment was beginning to demand evidence, real evidence, for therapeutic claims. And when researchers examined mineral spring therapy with rigorous scientific methods, they found little to support the extravagant promises. Yet, in the 1930s, with the Baker's ballrooms full of dancers and its spa packed with believers, these doubts seemed distant and irrelevant. The hotel thrived, the town prospered, and thousands of people continued to arrive, seeking healing in waters that sparkled with minerals and shimmered with hope. The golden age seemed like it would last forever, but the foundation was already cracking, invisible, fractures that would soon bring everything down. Chapter 5: T.B. Baker's Fall. The irony was cruel and inescapable. While the Baker Hotel flourished throughout the early 1930s, Theodore Brasher Baker himself was falling apart financially. The man who had built an empire of grand hotels across Texas, who had raised a 14-story palace in a town of 6,000, could not sustain his own creation. By 1934, just 5 years after the Baker's triumphant opening, T.B. Baker declared bankruptcy. The Great Depression had finally caught up with him. His various business interests, stretched thin across multiple properties and cities, collapsed under the weight of economic catastrophe. Control of the Baker Hotel passed to his nephew, Earl Baker, who had been serving as the hotel's manager since its opening. Earl was a capable administrator who also managed the family's Gunter Hotel in San Antonio, but he lacked his uncle's grand vision and entrepreneurial daring. Where T.B. Baker had been a dreamer willing to stop construction mid-project to add an Olympic-sized swimming pool, Earl was a pragmatist focused on keeping the operation profitable and functional. Remarkably, despite the ownership upheaval, the hotel continued thriving through the mid-1930s. Guests kept coming, the spa remained busy, the belief in mineral water healing held strong, at least for a while. The Baker's success seemed independent of who owned it, as if the building itself had developed a momentum that carried it forward regardless of management changes. But by the late 1930s, the world was changing in ways that would prove fatal to the Baker's core purpose. Medical science was advancing at an accelerating pace. Sulfa drugs were proving remarkably effective against diseases that had once been death sentences. Surgical techniques improved dramatically. Modern hospitals were becoming centers of genuine healing rather than places people went to die. Most devastatingly for mineral wells, doctors began quietly changing their recommendations. The shift was subtle at first. A doctor might still suggest the baths while also prescribing newer treatments, but the direction was clear. Medicine was becoming scientific, evidence-based, effective in ways that mineral water simply wasn't. The Baker Hotel hadn't changed, but its reason for existing was being quietly undermined by progress. What had been a health destination was starting to become just another hotel, albeit an unusually large and ornate one. Guests still came, but the composition was changing. Fewer people arrived specifically for healing. More came for conventions, business meetings, or simple leisure. The The spa remained open, but the absolute conviction that had once filled those treatment rooms was beginning to fade. People still took the mineral baths, but with less certainty that they were experiencing something miraculous. Business began to soften as the decade closed. The hotel remained profitable, but the trajectory had shifted. The explosive growth of the early years had plateaued. Earl Baker, watching the numbers carefully, could see troubling signs even if he didn't fully understand what they meant. The belief system that had built the Baker Hotel was dying, and soon, events beyond anyone's control would mask this underlying problem, creating a brief illusion that everything was fine. Chapter 6. The Boom Before the Final Fall. In October 1940, Salvation arrived in Mineral Wells wearing an olive drab uniform. Camp Wolters opened just outside town, transforming overnight into the largest infantry training base in World War II. Young men from across America poured into Palo Pinto County by the thousands, learning to march, shoot, and survive before shipping out to fight in Europe and the Pacific. The impact on Mineral Wells was immediate and staggering. The town's population exploded from 6,000 residents to nearly 30,000 almost overnight. Streets that had been quiet suddenly roared with military trucks. Restaurants that had served locals now fed endless waves of soldiers. And the Baker Hotel, which had been watching its spa business slowly decline, suddenly found itself at the center of a boom more intense than anything it had experienced during its golden age. The hotel experienced its greatest financial success during the war years. Every room was occupied, often double-booked, as guests checked in and out in rapid succession. Soldiers on weekend leave filled the lobby, seeking a taste of luxury and normalcy before returning to the grueling routine of training. Officers brought their families to stay at the Baker, one of the few places in the area that offered genuine comfort. Military events, dances, ceremonies, celebrations packed the ballrooms week after week. The Cloud Room Ballroom on the 14th floor hosted countless gatherings where young men in uniform danced with sweethearts and wives, knowing that many of them would soon be crossing an ocean toward battlefields they could barely imagine. The restaurants served meals around the clock. The swimming pool, that Olympic-sized centerpiece that had once promised healing, now rang with the laughter and shouting of soldiers seeking simple recreation. The hotel had never been busier, never more profitable, never more essential to the community around it. But beneath this prosperity lay a crucial and ultimately fatal irony. The soldiers flooding into Mineral Wells didn't come seeking miracle cures. These young men came for beds, meals, entertainment, and a brief escape from military life. The reputation that had built the Baker Hotel was irrelevant to them. The war prosperity masked this fundamental problem with perfect efficiency. With rooms constantly full and revenue pouring in, it was easy to ignore that the hotel's original purpose had evaporated. Earl Baker and the hotel's managers could look at the books and see success, but they were seeing the success of a generic hotel serving a temporary military population, not the success of a healing palace drawing believers from across the nation. The illusion couldn't last forever. In 1946, World War II ended. Camp Wolters shut down. The soldiers went home. And almost immediately, the Baker's business suffered. The rooms that had been perpetually occupied stood empty. The town's population crashed back toward its pre-war levels, leaving behind a main street lined with businesses that had expanded to serve 30,000 people, but now served 6,000 again. A brief hope appeared in 1951 when the military installation reopened as Fort Wolters, this time as a helicopter training base. Business improved slightly, but Fort Wolters was much smaller than Camp Wolters had been. It brought a fraction of the soldiers, generated a fraction of the economic activity. The revival was real but modest, nothing like the war years' boom. Chapter 7. The Long Decline. The 1950s brought changes to America that would have seemed like science fiction just a generation earlier. President Eisenhower's interstate highway system began crisscrossing the nation, fundamentally altering how Americans traveled. What had once been a 2-day journey with stops at grand hotels became a 6-hour drive with a quick overnight at a roadside motel. Air travel, once accessible only to the wealthy, became increasingly affordable for middle-class families. The lodging industry transformed to match these new patterns. Roadside motels, simple, inexpensive, convenient, sprouted along every major highway. Travelers no longer needed to venture into town centers to find accommodation. Across America, famous spa towns watched their prosperity evaporate. Hot Springs, Arkansas, once a glamorous destination that had inspired the Baker's design, saw its grand hotels close or convert to other uses. Saratoga Springs, New York, struggled to reinvent itself. The Mineral Springs health craze had collapsed completely, killed by the arrival of effective modern medicine. The Baker Hotel found itself trapped. It was too big, too expensive to maintain, built entirely for an industry that no longer existed. The heating costs alone for 450 rooms were staggering. The staff required to maintain the building, serve meals, and operate the facilities consumed whatever revenue the hotel generated. The hotel still attracted some business. In 1952 and again in 1955, the Texas Republican Party held their state conventions at the Baker, taking advantage of its capacity to accommodate 2,500 attendees. The Democrats followed in 1954. For these brief events, the ballrooms filled with delegates and the rooms housed party officials, giving temporary glimpses of the hotel's glory days. But these occasional conventions couldn't sustain a 14-story palace. The Baker needed hundreds of guests every week, all year round, to survive. Those guests had stopped coming. Earl Baker, now aging and without his uncle's visionary drive, watched the finances deteriorate year after year. In 1963, he made the announcement that many had feared. He would close the Baker Hotel permanently after his 70th birthday. On April 30th, 1963, after 34 years of operation, the Baker Hotel closed its doors. The finality was crushing. Walking through those empty hallways must have felt like touring a mausoleum. 450 guest rooms stood vacant, their beds made, their doors locked, waiting for guests who would never arrive. Mineral Wells reacted with shock. The town's entire identity had revolved around this building. Its economy depended on the visitors the Baker attracted. Local businesses that had thrived for decades suddenly faced an uncertain future. 2 years later, in 1965, hope flickered briefly when a group of local investors leased the structure from the Baker family. They reopened the hotel in a desperate attempt at revival. The revival was brief and marred by tragedy. In 1967, Earl Baker was found unconscious on the floor of the cavernous Baker Suite. He died of a heart attack in the very building his uncle had created. The revival attempt collapsed. By 1972, just 7 years after reopening, the Baker closed its doors for the final time, and there it stood, empty and silent in the center of Mineral Wells. A 14-story monument to an industry that had vanished. Chapter 8. The Decades of Decay. From 1972 to 2019, nearly 50 years passed while the Baker Hotel stood empty. The massive structure rose 14 stories above the center of downtown Mineral Wells. Every resident saw it daily. Every visitor noticed it immediately. The decay began almost immediately and accelerated with each passing year. Windows shattered on all 14 floors, leaving gaping holes that let rain and wind pour inside. The ballrooms saw their ornate ceilings collapse, sending plaster and wooden beams crashing onto the floors below. Water damage spread throughout the building like a disease. Nature began reclaiming what humans had abandoned. Small trees grew from piles of debris that had accumulated on interior floors. The cloud room stood exposed to the elements. Rain poured through the ruined ceiling. Snow drifted across the floor in winter. The polished wood that had once reflected the glow of chandeliers now warped and rotted under the assault of weather. Below, the Olympic-sized swimming pool that had been Texas's first hotel pool sat cracked and empty. The tiles that had once gleamed under carefully maintained mineral water were broken and missing. The town found itself economically trapped with no good options. Demolishing the building would cost millions of dollars. The structure was simply too large. Restoring the hotel would cost even more, with estimates running into the tens of millions. For a town whose population and economy had been declining for decades, these sums were impossible. As the decades passed, urban explorers began illegally entering the abandoned hotel and documented the decay with photographs that spread across the internet. The images were haunting: elegant staircases leading to collapsed floors, bathtubs filled with rubble, ballrooms open to the sky, hallways stretching into darkness. Ghost hunters arrived next, drawn by the building's scale and the tragedy of its abandonment. Paranormal legends began to grow. People claimed to see Earl Baker's ghost in the Baker suite. Others reported shadows moving through the empty ballrooms as if dancers from decades past were still waltzing to music. Some visitors swore they heard sounds, music, laughter, voices, echoing from floors that had been empty for years. In 2010, the television show Celebrity Ghost Stories featured actor Eric Balfour describing his alleged paranormal experiences at the Baker Hotel. 2 years later, in 2012, the popular show Ghost Adventures filmed an entire episode inside the building. Ghost tourism became the only industry connected to the Baker Hotel. The bitter irony was inescapable. People once traveled to mineral wells seeking healing for their bodies. Now they came seeking evidence of the dead. In a world where people no longer traveled to small towns for mineral spring therapy, where a hotel needed to justify 450 rooms or any substantial number of rooms in a town of 14,000 residents, the Baker had become an impossibility. A generation of Mineral Wells residents grew up with the abandoned Baker as their most prominent landmark. Children played in its shadow. Teenagers knew it had always been empty, a ruin older than their parents. The psychological impact was profound. Your town's greatest achievement, its most visible feature, was a monument to failure. The town's identity remained tied to the building despite its abandonment. Festivals referenced the Baker's history. Historical markers described its golden age. But the building itself remained a ghost, empty and decaying, looming over everything as a permanent reminder of promises that were never true. Until perhaps salvation finally arrived. Chapter 9, Restoration, Hope, or Illusion. In 2014, the citizens of Mineral Wells made a decision that revealed just how desperately they wanted to believe again. They voted to reallocate a portion of the city's sales tax toward the Baker Hotel restoration. A commitment of $4 million toward what everyone knew would be a $65 million project. But the vote passed. The town needed to believe that redemption was possible. The years passed with various plans proposed and abandoned. Then, on June 20th, 2019, hope arrived with a name: Laird Fairchild. A Dallas-Fort Worth-based investor, Fairchild announced he had purchased the Baker Hotel and secured the final funding needed for a complete restoration. In August 2019, Baker Hotel Development Partners unveiled their renovation plans in detail. The budget was set at $65 million. The design would reduce the original 450 rooms to 165 luxury rooms and suites. The second floor would house an enlarged spa, but this time, the marketing would focus on contemporary wellness rather than miracle cures, just modern relaxation and self-care. The target opening was announced as fall 2022. Construction began in late 2019 with tremendous fanfare. Workers entered the building for the first time in decades. Debris was cleared, structural assessments were conducted. Then the delays began. In May 2021, the reopening was pushed back to fall 2024. Supply chain issues, pandemic disruptions, and construction challenges were cited. By October 2022, the date had shifted again, now mid-2025. More complications, more unexpected costs. The pattern was becoming familiar, though few wanted to acknowledge it yet. September 2023 brought another delay. The optimism that had accompanied the initial announcement was eroding, replaced by a weary recognition that perhaps this restoration was more difficult than anyone had admitted. In July 2024, the truth emerged more clearly. Construction needed a $20 to $25 million loan to continue. Spring 2025's official announcement confirmed what many had begun to suspect. The reopening was now delayed until 2028, nearly a decade after Fairchild's purchase. The question haunting Mineral Wells was simple and terrifying. Is this another illusion? The difference, advocates argued, was fundamental. This time the faith wasn't in miracle water or pseudoscientific healing. It was in historical nostalgia and luxury tourism. The Baker would become a heritage hotel, a destination for people who appreciated history and architecture. Destination weddings would fill the ballrooms. Corporate retreats would book the meeting spaces. But could nostalgia sustain what pseudoscience couldn't? Who exactly was the target customer? Heritage tourists visit historic hotels, certainly, but they don't fill 165 rooms year-round. Destination weddings happen, but not every weekend. Corporate retreats book historic venues, but not consistently enough to sustain a 14-story hotel. The stakes for mineral wells were immense. If the restoration succeeded and the hotel thrived, the town would finally escape the shadow of failure that had defined it for half a century. If the restoration failed, then Mineral Wells would lose its last hope. The Baker would likely remain abandoned for decades more, but now, with the added weight of this failed restoration attempt, the town would have proven that even with massive investment and genuine effort, the hotel couldn't be saved. But there was a third possibility, perhaps more haunting than outright failure. What if the restoration succeeded beautifully? The hotel reopened to celebration and acclaim, but then failed economically within a few years. Then Mineral Wells would have a beautiful, empty hotel instead of a decaying one. The building would stand restored and magnificent, but still vacant. The town would discover that some buildings are haunted not by ghosts, but by economics. And no amount of money, effort, or hope, as construction continues, or pauses, or resumes toward the promised 2028 opening, one question remains unanswered. Can the Baker Hotel be redeemed, or is redemption itself just another illusion? Chapter 10. Belief, Illusion, and Consequences. The tragedy of the Baker Hotel was never rooted in evil. No villain built this palace. No conspiracy defrauded thousands of innocent people. The darkness at the heart of this story is quieter and more unsettling. False promises sold as truth. Belief marketed as certainty. Hope packaged and delivered to desperate people who had no reason to doubt what they were told. The medical reality, understood clearly now, but obscured in the 1920s and 30s, was straightforward. Mineral baths provided minimal therapeutic value beyond the placebo effect. Soaking in warm water offered relaxation. The heat improved circulation temporarily. Some minerals could be absorbed through the skin in trace amounts, providing minor benefits to skin conditions. But curing arthritis, healing kidney disease, restoring mental health, treating infertility, the water had no curative properties for these ailments. None. Drinking the mineral water was largely harmless. The high mineral content might cause mild digestive upset, but it wasn't dangerous. What made it tragic was that it was medically useless for the conditions it claimed to treat. A person with a bacterial infection who drank mineral water instead of seeking proper medical care wasn't being healed. They were delaying treatment, sometimes with fatal consequences. Patients genuinely believed they were being healed. People arrived at the Baker Hotel sick, spent days or weeks undergoing treatments, and often felt better when they left. The placebo effect is powerful. Rest, good food, relaxation, and the conviction that you're receiving effective treatment can produce real improvements in how you feel, even if the treatment itself does nothing. But some people delayed or avoided real medical treatment, trusting instead in the waters. They spent precious time at the Baker when they should have been seeing doctors who might have actually helped them. In an era before antibiotics, this delay often didn't matter. But when effective treatments became available, choosing mineral water over medicine became genuinely dangerous. The human cost was measured in more than just health outcomes. Families during the Great Depression sacrificed to afford trips to mineral wells and stays at the Baker Hotel. They saved money they desperately needed for food, clothing, or shelter because they believed the treatments would help their loved ones. They made rational decisions based on false information, and they paid the price in dollars and hope. The ethical question is complicated and doesn't have a simple answer. Were T.B. Baker and the hotel operators complicit in pseudoscience fraud? Were they knowingly selling snake oil to desperate people? The likely answer is a mixture of genuine belief and willful blindness. T.B. Baker was certainly a businessman motivated by profit. He built the hotel because he saw a market opportunity not purely from altruistic concern for the sick, but the 1920s and 30s culture genuinely believed in mineral springs therapy. It wasn't considered fraud at the time because the medical establishment itself endorsed these treatments. Medical journals published articles about mineral spring therapy. The treatments were presented as scientific, backed by professional authority. T.B. Baker and his staff likely believed they were providing a genuine health service while also making money. The fact that they were wrong doesn't necessarily make them villains. The cultural context matters enormously. 1920s and 30s, Americans trusted testimonials over peer-reviewed studies, which barely existed in the modern sense. They believed spectacle and confident marketing over careful evidence. This was the era of patent medicines promising miracle cures. Newspaper advertisements sold treatments for everything from baldness to cancer, backed by nothing more than confident claims and cherry-picked testimonials. Health fads swept the nation regularly, each one promising transformation through some new discovery or technique. The Baker Hotel fit perfectly into this landscape. It wasn't an outlier. It was typical of its time. By the late 1940s, no legitimate doctor would prescribe mineral baths over antibiotics. The choice was stark. The entire mineral springs industry, nationwide, collapsed within a decade. Mineral Wells economy was an entire town built on a foundation of sand. And it didn't end in the 1940s. Modern wellness culture still sells unproven treatments with the same confident marketing that built the Baker Hotel. Detox, cleanses promise to remove toxins that don't exist. Miracle supplements claim benefits unsupported by evidence. Alternative medicine practitioners offer treatments that sound scientific but lack rigorous proof. The language has changed, but the pattern remains the same. What happens when belief systems meet reality? Collapse, abandonment. Communities built on false promises don't slowly fade, they crash. It doesn't just chronicle one hotel's failure, it reveals what belief without evidence costs, measured in money, hope, and the futures of everyone who trusted what they were told. Chapter 11, The Legacy. The Baker Hotel stands today, under construction, delayed again, its future uncertain, as a monument to a strange and unsettling chapter in American history. Whether it reopens in 2028 as promised, or remains trapped in an endless cycle of renovation and delay, the building has already secured its place in memory. Not as a success story, but as a warning. It is not haunted by ghosts. The real darkness of the Baker Hotel was never malice. It was the slow, quiet collapse of collective belief. The moment when an entire town realized that everything they had built, everything they had trusted, was founded on promises that were never true. What does the Baker teach us? It teaches the danger of building economies, identities, and hopes on unproven promises. It demonstrates the fragility of belief when confronted with evidence. Truth, when it finally emerges, is ruthless. It reveals the human cost of pseudoscience. The cost wasn't just financial, it was measured in suffering and lost time. And it shows the lasting consequences when an entire community invests in illusion. Mineral Wells learned the hardest way. Whether the Baker reopens in 2028 or remains abandoned for another 50 years, it will always carry this history. But the building is forever tied to the lies that built it, to the belief system that sustained it, to the collapse that followed when truth finally arrived. One certainty exists: its story will never be forgotten. The Baker Hotel refuses to disappear from Mineral Wells' skyline or from memory. And it stands now as a reminder that some foundations, no matter how confidently built, were never strong enough to last.